myths about the bar exam. And in this video, I'm going to look at myth number 8 on my list of 10 myths. It's one of my favorites in kind of a weird sort of way. I mean, I don't like what it says, but it's really an important one to get out in the open. And the myth is very simply, in order to pass the bar exam, you have to work harder. Sounds good. Sounds like it ought to make sense. Sounds like it ought to be true. It's really not true at all. If you work harder, the myth says you're going to pass the exam, or at the very least, you'll do better on the exam. And you might say, wait a minute, this guy's telling me I don't have to work harder? He's got to be totally crazy. I mean, everybody knows, right, that you have to work really hard to pass the bar exam. And that's absolutely true. I have no problem with that part of it. The part of the myth that I think is problematic is that it's not a matter of working harder, and that's where the myth becomes so dangerous. You know, there are lots of people that buy bar review courses, and then the course that they buy, the big box, sits in the corner of their room. They never go to class, or they never sign online. They don't do any of the work. Do those people pass the bar exam? No, absolutely not. Unequivocally, no matter what urban myths you've heard. When the old guy in your law office says, you know, I just went and I took that old bar exam 30, 40, 50 years ago, and I just went to a hotel the week before, and I got me a fifth of Jim Beam, and I briefed some cases, and I sat in that hotel room, and then I went and took that galldarn exam, and I passed. Well, it's a nice story, and it lets me do my old guy voice. But you know what? It's not true, and you should run away from people like that because you can't do that anymore. So there's no doubt that putting in a minimum amount of time and just showing up at the exam is not going to work at all. But the problem that I want to talk about here is the other end of the spectrum. It's to those people who believe that the harder they work, the higher their score will go. In other words, they make the mental assumption that there is a one-to-one correlation between hard work and success on the exam. Now, let's dig into this myth in a little more detail. The presumption that I think a lot of bar students make incorrectly is that there is a direct correlation, a correlative factor between working hard and your score, and that factor is functionally one-to-one. In other words, the harder you work, if you put in, let's say, 1 more hour, it should result in X number of points being improved on your bar exam score. Now, that is true, but only to a basic minimum threshold. In other words, what we've seen is that our old guy who's putting in just a handful of hours, there's no improvement there at all. There's no score correlation that's positive. Then you start to put in some time, and your score does go up to a certain point, and then it levels off again and actually starts to decrease later. All the data that we've gathered from our own course over 25 years, plus our predecessor courses, plus the data gathered from the National Conference of Bar Examiners, we feel very confident in saying that it takes about 250 to 300 hours of study to successfully prepare for the bar exam across the country in any jurisdiction, whether you're talking about a very difficult jurisdiction like California or Texas or Florida, or you're talking about the 33 states of the UBE or anything in between. Now, if you think about those 250 to 300 hours, what we're describing is a prescribed course of study. It's not just random time invested. And if you follow that prescribed course of study with that prescribed course of hours, 250 to 300 hours, you should have a passing score. That's the correlation that the numbers support consistently over a long period of time. It's a good, tight correlation. So the problem becomes that most people don't understand or don't believe that correlation. And you get a student, a bar taker, that says, well, I assume if Jackson says I need 250 to 300 hours to complete the exam, well, he doesn't really know me. I'm a foreign trained attorney. I went to a not highly rated law school. I'm not a good writer. I'm not good at standardized tests, all the negative things that we want to tell ourselves. And some of those may have some element of truth, but they're still not fundamentally the whole picture. But in any event, this student says, you know what, I need more hours. In fact, rather than the 250 that Jackson was talking about, I think I need 500 hours, double that, to complete the exam or to complete the review process. Now, in this example, our bar applicant is working twice as hard as suggested. They're putting in twice the amount of time. And if the correlation that they're thinking in their brain is true, they get a double score, twice as high a score by putting in 500 hours as they'd get if they did 250 hours, and obviously then they'd pass the bar exam. Well, I think if you look at that correlation, you'd say, well, that's obviously not going to happen. You're not going to get double the score. But maybe you'd think to yourself, well, I bet they'd pass and pass by a lot by putting in more hours. I wish that were true. I wish it was that simple, that all you have to do is invest more hours and you'd be more successful. I wish the people that put in 500 or 600 or 700 hours or more passed. But the problem is they don't. When we go back and explore who's successful and not successful on the exam, there is a very strong correlation between failure and people that put in 400 or more hours. And that's frightening for people to hear because they think, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? Well, I'm going to give you some sense of that in a moment here, but I want to just make it very clear to you that more hours do not equate to higher scores. There is no correlation statistically that I've seen. The problem is that there's a point of diminishing return when you study. The harder you work, up to a certain level, you get results, for sure. But beyond that level, the tipping point or the inflection point kicks in, and now your results flatten, and then they begin to go down with even more time invested. And that's really a frightening thought. When this diminishment of scores occurs, it can be really unnerving. And you might say, well, why would the scores actually go down? I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense at first blush. But when you start to think about it, I would suggest you put it in terms maybe that we can all relate to. And we'll go back to law school. Remember sitting in law school, no matter where in the world you did your studies, you remember sitting in that 2-hour class, right? Remember coming back to you now? Yeah, sure you do. And you remember maybe the first hour and a half of that 2-hour class. If you were really, really good, maybe you remember an hour and 45 minutes. But much beyond that, you don't remember very much. And by 2 hours, all you remember is, I want to get out of this room, let this class be over with. Now imagine that if instead of a 2-hour class, you had a 3-hour class, and for some of you, you did, remember night students, for example. Or what if that class went for 4 straight hours, or 5 straight hours, or 6, or 7, or God forbid, 8 straight hours sitting in a classroom? How would you do then? Yeah, you would have what I call the bovine stare. You know, you got no idea. You're lost. There's nothing going on in your brain anymore. You've simply shut down. It's too much information. You've lost your ability somewhere along the way to concentrate and to focus. Now, if that was true sitting in a classroom, and I would dare say most of you did not hold your focus for a full 2-hour class unless you had the best professor in a subject that you really loved, and even then I bet there were off days when you didn't do it. So if it's impossible to do sitting in a classroom, why would it be any different when you're studying for the bar exam? In other words, there has to be a point of diminishing returns in your study. There is a point in which you've done too much. You simply can't absorb any more material. And the problem is that for the type A personalities who are drawn to law and to the bar exam for sure, they believe that the harder they work, the better they're going to do. It's what they've learned all their lives. It's how they got into school and college and law school and were successful up to this point. These are what I call the Chippendales. And I don't mean the dancers. These are the people that try to gather everything. You know, they're squirrels. They try to gather the nuts right before the fall comes in the season. And they take the approach, I've got to get it all. I've got to know it all. I've got to do it all. Well, that's okay to a point. But after you've gotten too many nuts, well, you start to look like Chippendale, you know, big squirrel cheeks. And then what happens? You drop all of them. There's too much. You see, you can only hold so much material in your brain. You can only do so much work and make it productive. And after that, the process of adding more information simply pushes out older information, and you have a zero-sum game going on. Now, another part of the problem of this overstudying, putting in too many hours, is what those hours actually are made up of doing. For most bar takers, anything over 300 hours of study is probably concentrated in 2 areas. First, in the area of trying to memorize, and second, in the area of question practice. So let's take a look at each of those in a little bit more detail. Now, when it comes to memorization, there's no doubt about the difficulty of the task. That's why mnemonics and flashcards and all sorts of strange things are part of the normal big box bar review kit. It's just painfully, awfully, terribly hard to memorize. I don't know anyone that says, oh goody, I'm going to memorize stuff, or I get to memorize stuff. Quick sidebar. When I was a young child, I was a stage actor. It's a long story, don't ask. But I was actually on stage in some plays, literally on the stage for over an hour and a half. And I had hundreds, I think maybe even more than 1,000 lines in a couple of plays that I had to learn. The problem was that started acting when I was 5 years old, and I actually was not old enough to read when I first went on stage. So there was no way for me to read and memorize in a traditional way. So what did we do? Well, my tutors, my directors, my coaches read me lines for hours and hours every day until I'd memorized them. It's really a wonderful, happy childhood, as you can imagine. Now, did I know anything about the words I was memorizing? Well, I don't think so. I had some pretty strange parts. And so I learned the words, but I didn't have any idea what I was actually learning. I just memorized words and sounds. And that's a lot like what some bar students do. They spend countless hours memorizing rules and elements and tests, and they have no actual idea how those rules or elements work together, how they are applied. And when you look at their answers and read those student essays, it's obvious that they don't know how they apply. It's simply, here's a rule, here's a rule, here's a rule. Oh, I spotted an issue, here's another rule. It doesn't make any sense. And the examiners don't reward that kind of behavior. But the cost is high. Hundreds of hours spent with flashcards and lists and mnemonics to remember the mnemonics and songs to remember the mnemonics to remember the mnemonics, and so it goes. And still no passing result for many of those people. So memorization as a way to spend your time is not very productive, and I'll talk about that in another one of these myths in even more detail. But what about question practice, that second area where people spend a lot of time? On its face, this one makes sense. Do more practice questions and the time would be well spent. That would be good for you. You'd get some additional work and practice in. And it's true, but again, only to a point. You see, when you exhaust yourself doing practice tests, particularly right before the exam, then you come to the test at your worst, not your best. I constantly hear from unsuccessful bar takers who use this approach with the big box bar reviews and come to me and say, when I got to the exam, I was so stressed out, I was sleep deprived, I was exhausted, I'd been doing practice tests 18 hours a day for the 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the exam, and I was literally had nothing left in my brain, in my energy, in any part of this to actually take the bar. It's a little bit like the marathon runner who for some strange reason decides to run a 26-mile race every day for 2 weeks before the actual marathon. Not likely that they'll finish the race, and even if they do, it's going to be ugly. And that's what it looks like for a lot of bar takers. They've lost it all in the practice and didn't save anything for the actual test. Now, don't get caught up in the myth or the fallacy that there's some magic number of questions that you should do each night, whether it's essays or multiple choice. One of the advantages, or maybe it's a disadvantage of having been around so long, is that you know where the bodies are buried. And in this particular case, I actually know where this fallacy of doing 50 MBE questions a night came from. You might remember in one of the other myths, I talked about a bar exam provider who got caught stuffing the MBE down his pants in Alaska. Well, this guy was quite a character, and he had a course that was a multi-state only course. It was a supplement course, and he would travel around the country for 7 or 8 weeks before the bar exam, every night a different city, leading his courses. And after each day's lecture, he liked to retire to the bar. I don't mean the legal bar, I mean the bar in the hotel, where he loved to pour a drink of scotch. But while he was in the bar, students would come up to him from the class that day and they would pepper him with questions. And frankly, after you've heard these questions a certain number of times, I got to admit, you just kind of like, oh my gosh, I don't want to hear any more questions, the same old stuff over and over again. And it really got so annoying that what he decided to do was to tell his students that they needed to go back each night after the 3-day or 6-day intensive and do 50 questions a night in their room to get ready for the next day. It wasn't because 50 questions a night was actually worth anything pedagogically, may have been, may not have been. It was just long enough period of time for him to go down to the hotel, have his dinner, have a drink, and get back to his room without being molested by bar takers who wanted to ask questions. And that's where 50 questions a night came from. True story. So, you see, it's kind of strange when these things take on a life of their own. And today I have people that say to me, oh, I got to do 50 questions a night. Yeah, not really. Is it good? Maybe. Is it bad? Maybe. Is there any reason to believe that doing them will change your result? None. None whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do practice questions or practice tests, but do them as directed. In a course like ours, that's in moderation, and it's done in a progressive manner over time. And the idea, in our course at least, is that you work down in depth on what you're having difficulty with and not doing practice questions broadly or generally on material that you already know. I think that that is a colossal waste of time. So I think you should view your studies at the end as being like part of being in a cone or a funnel in which you narrow down and narrow down and narrow down. And that kind of question practice makes sense. But this broad general practice that says I should do 2,000 MBE questions or 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000, well, really, it's an absolute loss of efficacy, and there's diminishing returns. And frankly, if you can get through all 2,100 MBE questions that we currently offer and all the answer explanations, that's a huge amount of work, and I don't think you need to do more than that. So you see, in both of these problem areas, memorization and question practice, what we often see are students that work themselves into a frenzy. They panic thinking that they have to know everything. And because they can't really know everything, well, you know what's going to happen. They start to beat themselves up. They start running the negative self-talk of, I'm not learning enough, I'm not memorizing enough, I'm not doing well enough on my practice tests. How will I be able to remember this for 2 months or 3 months or 4 months or 6 months? And the answer is that they won't. If your approach to the bar exam is to try and memorize instead of gaining mastery, you're probably going to lose. Why? Because quite simply, memorization and recitation of rules are not the skill that's being tested. Now, let's take a step back from memorization and question practice for a moment and ask this question. The bar examiners, I suppose, would say that you have to work hard in order to be ready for the test. But the question is, do they really reward extra hard work? In other words, do they give you a benefit or a premium for that extra work you put in? Do you get a higher score? And as I suggested earlier, the statistical answer seems to be pretty consistently no, they don't. A minimum level of competence is what the examiners are looking for on any exam in any jurisdiction. To take just one example, the multi-state bar exam, the MBE, requires about a 60 to 65% passing rate on the test. In other words, you want to get around 130, 135 questions correct out of the 200 that are given. Now that means there's a lot of room for error. You could miss 70 questions and still pass, or 60 questions and still pass. So when you work harder to get some of those 70 extra questions right, presuming that you could, and I'm saying that statistically we don't see any reason to believe you can, but even if you could, there's a diminishing return for each question that you get correct over a certain number because it takes so much more extra effort to get that one question. And for some of you, you labor over the very tough questions. For me, that's anything having to do with the rule against perpetuities. But it's only worth 1 point, the same as the easy question that perhaps you never got to. So what happens is that the student that works exponentially harder, puts in more time and more energy, undoubtedly has to take away from other work, other things that they should be doing in their studies. And so as a result, one of the things that I think the bar examiners actually are testing is measuring whether or not you have good preparation and study skills. Do you have the ability to manage your time leading up to the bar exam? Can you balance your anxiety, your energy, to work in all of the different fields of law that the exam tests? You know, it doesn't do you any good to be an expert in just one subject. Maybe you're great in wills and trusts, but you don't know anything else. Well, that's not a good use of your time. And so you have to be a generalist. You have to be balanced in order to be successful. And that doesn't come from working madly or crazy. It doesn't come from 400 or more hours of study for the bar. It comes instead from working intelligently and working towards the test. So that when people say to you, what you have to do is to work harder, don't take that at face value. You might have to work hard enough to achieve that minimum threshold, and if you're not putting in the 250 hours, well, that's not going to be a successful outcome for you. But if you're in a course like ours, we'll tell you exactly what that threshold of time is and what the amount of work should be and where to spend your hours. And if you're studying on your own or you're in another course, and that would be a disappointment, but at least I would say you should try to figure out what's a minimum that it would take for you to get through the material. And if you can't figure it out, you're welcome to use our numbers. As I say, 250 to 300 hours is the statistic that we find is the sweet spot for preparing for both the multi-state and a state exam. But if you're thinking today that I have to spend 400, 500, 600, 700, 800 hours or more, well, that's just crazy. And I hear from people sometimes who say, you know, I need to take an exam 18 months or 2 years from now because I need hundreds and hundreds of hours to study. No, you don't. You went to law school, you got a law degree, maybe you've been practicing law for a few years, maybe for a lot of years. You'll get into the material. You don't need to know everything, and the more hours you spend, the worse it's going to get. Look, the point of all of this is to get to the exam with your best self, not looking like a refugee from the haunted mansion at Disney World, so tired that you're huddled into the crowded mass in the center. Don't do that. There's no reason to be in that position, and that's why this myth is so dangerous for people. It's not a way to take the test. It's a way to fall apart, to have fatigue, to collapse, and to be sick, and all sorts of bad things can happen when you've exhausted yourself by working too hard. So, as in many areas of life, moderation is the key. Work productively, work consistently, don't go crazy, and you'll be able to pass the bar exam.